Hi there, we're continuing our journey through Luke's Gospel, and today we're looking at chapters 11 and 12. Now, the eagle eyed among you will have noticed that we already did chapter 11 yesterday. Georgia did chapters 10 and 11, but there's a really important reason why we're repeating it, and that's what happens at the start of 11 and what happens at the end of 11. At the start, is the disciples' prayer, the prayer that Jesus teaches the disciples. Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us, and lead us not into temptation. That's a really, really key prayer. And it's quite interesting when you read different commentaries, they find dividing these chapters a little bit difficult because it seems like Jesus does this really nice teaching on prayer and then he dives into loads of conflicts. And Georgia spoke a little bit about the sign of Jonah, some of the arguments that Jesus has, and then he pronounces these 6 different woes on the Pharisees. But actually, the Lord's Prayer is key to understanding that. We might be so familiar with it, it feels a bit bland, or we could say it off by heart. But actually, it's really, really dramatic. To pray to God is one of the most intimate, profound things we can do. It says so much about who we are, and it says so much about who God is. How we approach him is really important. And the fact that Jesus' disciples ask him to teach them to pray is really important too. Not only because Jesus retreats to pray a lot in the Gospel of Luke, but actually because Jewish people knew how to pray. They knew how to pray the Shema, which is taught in Deuteronomy 6. They knew how to pray through the scriptures, to use the Psalms to pray. So to go and say, can you teach us to pray, is a big statement. You have something about who God is and who we are that is important, that we need to anchor ourselves in prayer. And he does. We actually see other communities around the time of Jesus also develop their own rhythms and patterns of prayer as ways of teaching and discipling themselves, including the community that some of you might have heard around Qumran, that created the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's loads of long prayers in there that are quite revealing as to their worldview and their view of God. But when we read the Lord's Prayer, it straight away starts with Father, this sense that Jesus is teaching his disciples how to relate to God, to relate to him as Father, the difference between the Lord your God, the unspeakable name, and the Father is a big difference. There's the holiness of God, the otherness of God, and that's brought out when Jesus starts to get in debates about his power and his authority throughout here. Actually, his authority is from God. There's the teaching of your kingdom come. And we see throughout Luke that Jesus is drawing his kingdom in a really wide, inclusive way. Then there's this sense of daily bread, and we've seen people being fed who are poor and impoverished in Luke's gospel. And there's a sense of who Jesus is speaking to. Jesus is speaking into the margins. And there's this great verse, forgive us our sins as we also forgive everyone. And actually the Greek word is different. So the first time it uses the typical word for sin. The second time it uses the word for debtors. We forgive all of our debtors. And that isn't just financial debt, that's also the debt of honour, that's religious debt, social debt. And I think Jesus is tying all this together, and it really ties into his kind of, the way he starts his ministry. I've come to proclaim freedom and release. And actually that freedom and release is sins, but it's also debts. And lead us not into temptation. And this is where this prayer is really key in driving us forward in the narrative, because actually Jesus is talking about his coming kingdom and what's going to happen right now, and he's preparing the disciples for that, but he does it in a way that's provocative, in a way that questions some of the religious assumptions of his opponents and those around him. So when we dive into chapter 12, the new bit, first of all, what does it say? Well, basically Jesus is preparing his disciples for trial and judgment. So there's warnings and encouragements. Don't be like the Pharisees. Beware their influence. Beware acting like them. There's a parable of a rich fool who is just unaware of his lack of control of circumstance and tries to plan ahead without taking into account what God would have him do. There is beautiful teaching about worry, which we're going to come to and read at the end. There's some teaching about watchfulness, about being aware, and that's a big thing that Jesus talks about in a lot of his parables and a lot of his teaching. There's teaching about really provocative teaching. He's not come to bring peace but division, and then talks about interpreting the times that are happening. Now, these verses, probably stripped out of context, could be used to talk to the crisis that we're in now. And in fact, some Christians are taking those verses and thinking we're in the midst of some sort of judgment or chaos, or where is God in all of this? But actually, Jesus is talking in a very real context. The meaning of these verses is Jesus is preparing his disciples for the journey to the cross, for all that he's going to go through. He's preparing them for the conflict and the opposition that they're going to face, not just at the cross, but actually, remember Luke and Acts, one book, as the church in Acts goes out and spreads the gospel message, they face persecution and opposition, and many of them lose their lives. And Jesus here, he isn't predicting the destruction that's going to come, but he is preparing them. He's preparing them to be the disciples they need to be. He's preparing them to know God in the proper way. And that's a really, really key theme in this. So what do we do? What do we take from this? We're called to be watchful. We're called to interpret the times, to perceive truly what is happening. We're called to not be discouraged because we face opposition, because if Jesus faced opposition, we will face opposition. If Jesus had to go through death, we will battle in this world that is marked by death and chaos and destruction. We don't live in the new creation yet. We are not in the fully to be. But I think one of the things that we can take the most from this is Jesus' teaching on peace. Jesus says to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest?" And he goes on and on and on and on. Beautiful, beautiful verses. But we're given this really pure teaching at the end that I think is what we can hold on to today. What we need to do is take hold of the kingdom that Jesus has given us and prepare for ourselves treasures in heaven, not treasures on earth. Right now, in a time of hoarding and worry, we could gather together all the treasures on earth and hold on to them and feel secure. But actually, we're called to be generous, to be loving, to give away some of our freedom right now, actually, in order that we would build up treasure in heaven, that we would sow into that which has eternal value, that is Jesus and his kingdom. So take heart. And as you read these really challenging verses today, my prayer for you is that you would take heart and know God's peace with you. Amen.